James grew up watching his grandfather do something that seemed strange to everyone outside the family. Every Sunday evening, his grandfather, who had emigrated from mainland China in the 1970s and built a modest but stable life in a small American city, would sit at the kitchen table for about 20 minutes with a small notebook and a pen. He would write down every dollar that had come in that week and every dollar that had gone out. Not into an app, not into a spreadsheet, into a physical notebook he kept in the same kitchen drawer for 30 years. His grandfather was not a wealthy man by any external measure. He drove a practical car, the house was modest, he cooked almost every meal at home. He did not carry credit cards. By the time James was old enough to understand what the notebook represented, his grandfather had saved enough to pay for James's first year of college in full, help two of his children put down payments on homes, and retire without financial stress at a time when most people around him were still working out of necessity. James asked his grandfather once what the secret was. His grandfather tapped the notebook and said, "I always knew where the money was going." That was all. This video is about that principle, the financial mindset embedded in Chinese saving culture that produces savings rates dramatically higher than the Western average, what drives it culturally and psychologically, and how anyone can apply the same framework regardless of where a person was raised. The single most striking data point in any comparison of Chinese and American financial behavior is the savings rate. China's gross domestic savings rate has consistently hovered between 40 and 50% of income for the past 2 decades. That means for every $100 earned, roughly $45 gets set aside rather than spent. The United States savings rate over the same period has generally sat between 3 and 6%, occasionally spiking during periods of economic disruption when spending opportunities contract, but returning to the low single digits in normal conditions. This is not a marginal difference. It is nearly a 10-to-1 ratio between two of the world's largest economies. Understanding why the gap exists is not just academically interesting, it is practically useful, because the behaviors and beliefs that produce a 45% savings rate are learnable regardless of where a person was raised. The gap does not come from income differences. China's per capita income is significantly lower than America's. The gap comes from something cultural, structural, and psychological, a fundamentally different relationship with money that shapes every spending and saving decision from childhood onward. The first reason Chinese saving culture operates differently is that money itself carries a different meaning. In China, financial prudence is not considered deprivation, it is considered a virtue, a sign of discipline, reliability, and respect for the future. Children are introduced to the concept of saving not as a burden, but as something honorable. The red envelope tradition during Lunar New Year, where children receive monetary gifts, is accompanied almost universally by parental encouragement to save rather than spend. The money is referred to as lucky money, and the luck is understood to compound only if it is preserved. The cultural messaging around wealth is also different in a specific and consequential way. In American consumer culture, the primary signal of financial success is visible consumption. What you drive, where you live, what you wear. Wealth is supposed to be visible. In traditional Chinese culture, visible display of wealth carries a different connotation. Restraint, modesty, and avoiding ostentation are considered markers of genuine substance. A person who saves quietly and lives humbly is often regarded as more trustworthy and respectable than someone who spends visibly to broadcast success. This cultural difference produces a different default behavior around money. When the cultural norm is to display wealth through spending, people spend even when it diminishes their actual financial position. When the cultural norm is to build wealth through saving, People save even when spending would be more immediately enjoyable. Beyond culture, specific structural realities of Chinese society have historically reinforced the saving habit in ways that persist even as those structures evolve. The absence of a robust, reliable social safety net means that individual and family savings have historically been the primary defense against medical emergencies, unemployment, and old age. Chinese workers have access to a national pension system, but trust in its long-term stability and adequacy has historically been limited. Healthcare costs, education costs, and retirement security are understood to be primarily personal responsibilities rather than systemic guarantees. When your savings account is the only thing standing between you and a health crisis or a retirement without resources, saving is not a preference, it is survival strategy. The savings rate reflects the level of individual responsibility each person believes they carry for their own future. American culture, by contrast, has historically operated with the assumption of systemic backstops: Social Security for retirement, Medicare for health care, employer benefits for stability. Whether or not those backstops are adequate, the cultural assumption of their existence reduces the psychological urgency of personal saving. When you believe the system will catch you, you save less. When you believe only you will catch you, you save more. James's grandfather's notebook was an expression of what financial planners in Western countries now call zero-based budgeting, though the practice predates the Western terminology by generations in Chinese household management. The core principle is simple and powerful. Every dollar of income gets assigned a specific destination before it is spent. Income minus all allocations equals zero, not because everything is consumed, but because savings, investments, and future goals are treated as allocations equal in status to rent and groceries. The money going to savings is not what is left over after spending. It is one of the first things allocated, treated with the same non-negotiability as a utility bill. The practical difference between this approach and the American default is structural. Most American households operate on a spend-then-save model. Income arrives, expenses happen throughout the month, and whatever remains at the end gets saved. The predictable result is that almost nothing remains, because spending expands to fill available resources. The zero-based approach inverts the sequence. Income arrives, allocations happen first, including savings, and spending happens within what remains. James's grandfather's notebook worked on this principle without the label. He knew what was coming in, he knew what was going out. He assigned every dollar a job before spending began. The result was not deprivation, it was intentionality. He enjoyed his life within a structure that guaranteed his savings were funded before discretionary choices were made. Within the broader framework of intentional budgeting, 4 specific behavioral principles appear consistently in Chinese saving culture and produce the results the savings rate data documents. The first is a deliberate distance from status spending. Chinese saving culture has historically held that purchasing things primarily to signal status to other people is a waste of resources that could be building real security. The person who saves quietly while appearing modest is often more admired in traditional Chinese culture than the person who spends visibly. This is the direct inverse of American consumer culture, where visible consumption is the primary signal of success. The financial result of this value difference, compounded across decades of spending decisions, is enormous. The second is the principle of living on a deliberately small fraction of income. James's grandfather described this as trying to live on $1 for every 10 earned. Not always achievable, but always aspirational. The commitment to keeping lifestyle costs as low as possible relative to income creates the gap where wealth is built. This is not a scarcity mindset in a damaging sense. It is a deliberate preservation of margin that gives compound interest the raw material it needs to work. The third is the rigorous distinction between needs and wants, and the discipline to spend generously on genuine needs while being skeptical of wants. Chinese saving culture is not opposed to spending. It is opposed to spending that does not deliver genuine and lasting value. A quality purchase that serves a real function for many years is worth the cost. An expensive item purchased primarily for the feeling it provides briefly or for the signal it sends to others is viewed with suspicion. The mental habit of asking honestly whether something is a need or a want before spending and being genuinely honest with the answer produces a different spending pattern over time. The fourth is cooking and eating at home as a default rather than an exception. This is perhaps the most universal of the four principles across cultures, and it is also the most immediately impactful for most households. Restaurant and delivery spending represents one of the most significant areas of discretionary expenditure for American households, and it is also one of the easiest categories to reduce without meaningfully diminishing quality of life. Chinese household culture has traditionally centered social connection around home cooking and shared meals rather than restaurant outings, which simultaneously reduces costs and deepens relationships. James started his own version of the notebook at 26. Not a physical notebook, he used a spreadsheet, but the principle was identical to what his grandfather had done for 30 years in that kitchen. Every dollar of income got assigned before spending began. Savings allocations happened first. Every week he could see exactly where his money was going and whether the allocation matched his actual values. The result, he says, was not that he spent less in any painful sense. He spent differently. Money that had been disappearing into forgettable expenses, subscriptions he had stopped using, meals that had become habits rather than enjoyment, purchases that felt important for about a week, got redirected towards things he actually valued and towards his savings goals. The savings rate he built over his 30s was not 45%. American housing costs and student debt made the Chinese comparison unrealistic as a direct target. But the principle, every dollar assigned, savings treated as a non-negotiable allocation, wants evaluated honestly against needs, produced a savings rate more than double what his peers were managing on similar incomes. The Chinese secret to saving money is not, in the end, exotic or difficult to access. It is a way of thinking about money, a set of default assumptions about what saving means, what spending is for, and whose responsibility the future is. Saving is honorable, every dollar should have a destination, lifestyle should be kept deliberately below income, spending on appearance is waste, needs deserve investment, wants deserve scrutiny. Home and family are where resources are built and shared. James's grandfather knew where his money was going at every point in his life, in a small notebook in a kitchen drawer. And that single habit, that refusal to let money move without his full awareness and intention, was the foundation of everything he built. The notebook is available to anyone.